Change. We all do it. Some of us do it on purpose, whilst others just slowly grow over time. Despite what some people will tell you, it's not always a bad thing. In fact, it will often afford us new experiences or opportunities. The same rules apply to the video game industry, and if anything, video games sometimes need to shake things up a bit in order to ensure that their audience stays engaged. Many series have stuck with the same formula over the years whilst just tweaking one or two bits, whilst others have taken their own rulebooks and tossed them out of the window. For this list, we're looking at video game series that have evolved so much over the years that when you compare what they are today to where they started out, you'll be hard-pressed to tell that they're anything to do with one another. I'm Peter from TripleJump, and here are 10 video game franchises that look nothing like their former selves. Number 10. Final Fantasy. Considering that it formed a large part of many gamers' childhoods, it's easy to forget that the Final Fantasy series has been gracing our consoles for well over 3 decades, with the first title hitting the NES all the way back in 1987. The OG Final Fantasy was a pixelated, colourful affair in which a group of youths known as the Light Warriors quest together to defeat the evil forces that have darkened their world. The game was a huge critical and commercial success, so it naturally spawned a whole parade of sequels that closely followed the formula of the original. Fast forward to today, and the Final Fantasy games have changed so much that it's difficult to believe they came from such humble beginnings. Not only have the graphics naturally improved over the years, but the overall linearity of the gameplay and narrative has been scrapped in favour of an open world with more side quests than you could shake a Buster Sword at. There's even been an incredibly successful foray into MMORPG territory, and the overall universe has grown exponentially, elevating a game that Square initially refused to develop into multiple worlds full of rich characters and expansive lore. Number 9. Donkey Kong. If an arcade-loving time traveller from the 1980s just happened to fast forward 4 decades and feast their eyes on what became of Donkey Kong, I doubt they believe the eponymous gorilla that we're all now used to is anything at all to do with the original title. Indeed, the Great Ape started out life as the villain of his franchise, kidnapping the helpless Pauline and flinging endless barrels at a very early Mario, or Jumpman if you want to get serious about this. The aim of the arcade favourite was to navigate the pixelated plumber up the level, avoiding numerous hazards along the way, and ultimately saving the girl. These days, however, Donkey Kong is the hero, and instead of just standing at the top of a static level, he can be found platforming his way through jungles, across sandy beaches, and even around ancient temples. He's even been the victim on a couple of occasions, with the likes of Donkey Kong Country 2 seeing the titular character kidnapped and imprisoned himself. Mario may be the breakout star of the original, but we can't help but admire the journey that Donkey Kong has gone on, and whilst the original 1981 arcade title is still highly enjoyable, the switch to a protagonist role has blessed us with years of banana collecting, bongo slapping fun. Number 8. Grand Theft Auto. It's fair to say that despite it having been a quarter of a century since the first GTA came to PC and PlayStation, the franchise has never lost the spirit of the original. That spirit being cause chaos, get money, and flip the police. Aside from that, however, if you compare the first couple of outings with more recent ones, you'd be hard-pushed to find much else they have in common. 1997's original Grand Theft Auto was a linear, top-down action-adventure where the aim of the game was to accrue enough points to pass the level. This could be done in a number of ways, from causing death and destruction to undertaking jobs for the local crime syndicates. The more recent games, by comparison, couldn't be more different, having scrapped the top-down gameplay after GTA 2 in favour of a third-person perspective from GTA 3 onwards. The linearity was also lost, with players now able to freely roam their surroundings, and instead of collecting points to pass levels, goals became mission-based, proper big boy narratives were introduced, and side quests became available outside of the main story. As well received as all of these changes were, however, we still can't forgive GTA 4 for cousin Roman. Number 7. Fallout. There are many similarities between the first two Fallout games and the more recent titles in the series, but for every one thing they have in common, there's a whole load of ways in which they differ. Developed by Interplay Productions, Fallout and Fallout 2 are both turn-based role-playing games in which players need to navigate the wasteland in order to secure items to ensure the survival of their comrades. Though the second game is somewhat grander in scope than the first, it still retains very similar graphics and gameplay mechanics, with players earning XP through exploration and combat that can be used to improve their special attributes. In the 10 years between Fallout 2 and 3, development moved to Bethesda, and by the time the latter was released in 2008, it had undergone a huge overhaul. The top-down gameplay was eschewed in favour of a first or third-person view, and the combat system was scrapped, with the developer instead introducing VATS, a blend of turn-based and real-time combat. The change in approach ultimately paid off, with Fallout 3 releasing to critical acclaim, receiving numerous Game of the Year awards, and being cited by many as one of the greatest games of all time. Number 6. Red Dead. Although there are a number of aesthetic similarities between Rockstar's 2004 cowboy romp Red Dead Revolver and its successors, if you scratch just a little bit below the surface, it's hard to even believe that they're related. Despite having many of the same ingredients as Redemption and its sequel, i.e. the third-person perspective, an Old West setting, and a gun-toting protagonist, Revolver didn't have any of the characteristics of a Rockstar game that audiences had grown to love. Progression was linear, the world felt a bit lackluster, especially when compared with the likes of GTA 3, and the narrative was a little shallow. Don't get us wrong, Red Dead Revolver is a fun cowboy shooter, it's just a world away from its sequels, both of which brought players into a rich open world and made them feel truly like they were part of the Wild West. Along with the new gargantuan environment that they were free to roam as they wished, Redemption also gave players a complex, engaging narrative, three-dimensional characters that felt like real, horrible people, and exquisitely well-written dialogue, all of which helped immerse fans in a true Western experience. Just call me Pistols Pete. Number 5. Saints Row. It's hard to believe that a series as daft as Saints Row ever attempted to take itself seriously. But long before the dubstep gun and the baseball bat shaped like a Wilson, Saints Row was a straight-laced, gritty gang drama. The original 2006 title was praised by many for its open world, which players could explore in order to gain respect. Unfortunately, far too many comparisons were drawn to GTA, with many feeling that the game lacked originality and borrowed far too much from Rockstar's franchise. Presumably, with that criticism in mind, developer Volition took the decision to throw realism right out the window and slowly increase the wacky dial up to 11. Although Saints Row 2 retains an echo of its predecessor, it allows players to stray onto the silly path by allowing them to gain respect for things like streaking or throwing themselves into oncoming traffic. From there, the whole series went bonkers, with Saints Row 4 taking place inside a simulation where superhero-style abilities are the order of the day, and character customization is Batman villain levels of insane. At this point, probably the most surprising thing Saints Row 5 could do would be to go back to gritty realism. Oh, that'd be a real bait and switch, wouldn't it? Number 4. Wolfenstein. In the 40 years since the release of the original Wolfenstein, the main premise hasn't changed very much. You fight Nazis, kick them if you want to, thwart whatever evil plans they're on with, and save the day with your massive guns. The first two games, Castle Wolfenstein and Beyond Castle Wolfenstein, were top-down 8-bit adventures that had a heavy emphasis on stealth. Rather than attempting to attack guards, players were instead encouraged to either sneak past them or impersonate them. Though there was just a 3-year gap between the first two titles, it would be almost a decade before fans got another sequel. And oh boy, had there been a few changes. In huge juxtaposition to the top-down covert affairs that players had been used to, 1992's Wolfenstein 3D was instead a first-person shooter that required a far more violent approach. Rather than trying to avoid enemies, players would need to unleash their full firepower, all while managing their health and ammunition supplies. Though it was quite the departure from the series' roots, Wolfenstein 3D was well received by pretty much everyone that played it, and it's now regarded as one of the founding fathers of the first-person shooter. Without it, the genre as we know it today might look very different. Number 3. Persona. Believe it or not, it's been 25 years since the first Persona game was released for the PS1, and in that time, the series has undergone such a huge transformation that players of the more recent titles may not even realise that they share a franchise with the earlier entries. The first game, Revelations:*Persona, or Shin Megami Tensei Persona if you want to get PSP about this, focuses on a group of friends as they investigate a series of mysterious happenings in the small town of Lunarville. The work of character designer Kazuma Kaneko, did I say that right, influenced the overall aesthetic of the game, and so the whole thing is an almost gothic affair. Fast forward just a few years to the production of Persona 3, and the role of character designer shifted to someone else whose name I can't pronounce, Shinigori Soejima, who brought his own style to the games, and moved them towards the unique manga artwork that we've seen in the most recent titles. Though some aspects have remained, such as the silent protagonist, the setting, and the concept of personas, the games have evolved everything from their gameplay mechanics to their overall atmosphere. One thing remains the same, however, and it's that there are many who, despite all of the changes to the series, still consider them to be some of the best RPGs of all time. Number 2. Castlevania. When it was released in 1986, the OG Castlevania was a side-scrolling platformer developed by Konami that saw our hero, Simon, fighting off various monsties with the ultimate aim of bringing down Count Dracula himself. For years, the games remained very similar, and though the graphics did improve a little over time, Castlevania continued to deliver 2D side-scrolling beastie fighting fun for all the family. The franchise arguably peaked with the release of 1997's Symphony of the Night, which despite debuting at a time where 3D visuals were becoming all the rage, still garnered widespread praise from audiences for its graphics, gameplay, and oh my, that twist. If you know, you know. After more than a decade of perfecting their 2D formula, Konami finally caved to the 3D crowd in 1999 with the flawed Castlevania 64, and continued to struggle through that troublesome extra dimension in subsequent entries. But the most radical change came in 2010, when Konami roped in the man, the myth, the legend, Hideo Kojima for the series reboot, Lords of Shadow. This game was a departure not just visually and dimensionally, but also in its gameplay, ditching the trademark Metroidvania staples in favour of a third-person action-adventure style. Thankfully, it was the best received of the 3D Castlevanias, but the sequels, well, we don't talk about the sequels. And number 1, Resident Evil. It's got to be nearly impossible to name any other franchise that's undergone as many changes as the Resident Evil series. Beginning life in 1997 as a straight-up survival horror game, Resident Evil placed heavy emphasis on careful inventory management and puzzle solving. The first 2 sequels also used this same formula, sticking with the original engine, fixed camera angles, and tank controls. Things very much changed with the release of Resi 4, however, when the series made the switch to an over-the-shoulder third-person view and really kicked things up a notch when it came to the storytelling, voice acting, and gameplay. Though still rooted in survival horror with its puzzles and inventory management, it was Resident Evil 4 that began the series' descent into shooter territory, with Resident Evils 5 and 6 feeling more like generic action offerings, with a few zombies maybe sprinkled in for good measure, I suppose. With the fanbase slightly jaded by the lack of scares and all of the boulder punching, when it came time for Capcom to release another sequel, they opted to go right back to the drawing board, giving us the stellar but pant-wettingly scary Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. Although the spookums were back, however, not a great deal else from the original games was, with 7 opting for a first-person tale and no zombies, keeping only subtle links to the series' previous villains. For fans, 7 was a return to to form for the franchise, and with Village continuing the success of its predecessor, we hope that Capcom has learned its lesson when it comes to putting too much action in its Resident Evil.